a lot of people vaguely know that a lot of times when sanctions are imposed on a country, it kills a huge number of people. And when we covered the letter that Osama bin Laden wrote to the American people in 2002 to justify the 9/11 attack, one of the main points he raised, in addition to U.S. troops on Saudi soil and U.S. support for Israel to repress the Palestinians, was exactly that. The sanctions regime imposed on Iraq in the 1990s, a decade worth of sanctions, ended up killing hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis. And that is often what the result is of the sanction regime. Note that the sanction regime, while it killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, did not remove Saddam Hussein from power. He stayed in power through 2003. It took an actual full ground invasion to remove him from power. But the sanction regime did nothing to Iraq other than kill a huge number of its citizens and immiserate the population. And for what? Here's the report of the International Committee of the Red Cross in December of 1999, Iraq, 1989 to 1999, a decade of sanctions. Quote, according to the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF survey published in August 1999, infant mortality in most of Iraq has more than doubled in the 9 years since U.S. sanctions were imposed. That's infant mortality, the number of babies we killed, Iraqi babies. In central and southern Iraq, home to 85% of the population, the death rate for children under 5 rose from 56 per 1,000 live births in the period 1984 to 1989 to 131 per 1,000. According to UNICEF statistics for November 1997, a third of all children under 5 are chronically malnourished. This represents a 72% increase since 1991. So when you're thinking about the effects of the sanctions regime and the idea that it's benevolent, it may not seem like it's that big of a deal if you're in the country imposing it. But if you're in the country on whom it's being imposed, the result is things like a third of all children in the country under the age of 5 become chronically malnourished at a rate of 72% higher than prior to the imposition of the sanctions regime. What do you think the people in that country and in that region start to think about the United States when they watch things like children, enormous numbers, dying of malnourishment and starvation, unable to get basic medications that they need to cure and treat highly treatable diseases that they die from instead, all while the government remains not only in place and entrenched, but even stronger. The UNICEF article goes on, quote, Iraq's 130 hospitals, many of them built by foreign companies in the 1960s to the 1980s, have not received the necessary repairs or maintenance since the Gulf War, but above all since the imposition of sanctions. They often lack, the hospitals do, the most basic tools such as stethoscopes, sterilizers, and writing paper. The negative impact on the treatment received by patients, and hence on their health, is immense. Now here's a notorious video in which the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, who presided over the sanction regime imposed on the Iraqi people, was actually asked on 60 Minutes a question that I think these days you would never hear a corporate media journalist ask of a Democratic Secretary of State. And this is a clip that resonated all throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and people in the West saw it too. I mean, it's an incredibly sociopathic face that Madeleine Albright showed the world, and it didn't have to do with invasions or bombing campaigns or any of the things we typically associate with the U.S. war machine. Instead, it was about sanctions.
She says the U.S. is trying to prevent Saddam Hussein from making and dropping a nuclear bomb or chemical weapons on other countries. And she says he's still lying about his weapons programs.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat?
Let me just ask you this question. It is definitely the case that if you are a policymaker at a top level inside the US government, you have hard choices. It's not like any one of your choices in certain situations will be morally pure. I suppose we have to accept the fact that the most powerful country on the planet, which is what the United States was, especially in the 1990s, that was the decade after the Soviet Union fell. We were told we were going to get this great peace dividend where we wouldn't have to spend money on our military anymore. And of course, the Clinton administration found all sorts of wars to fight, including in the Balkans. That was when Madeleine Albright said to Colin Powell, who was opposed to the intervention in the Balkans, what's the point of having this big, shiny, beautiful military if we don't use it? It was like a toy to her. You know, like, hey, we paid for this, why don't we use it? But even if you want to give them license that, look, there's people they have to kill, there's violence they have to use, you would think someone's conscience would be bothered by that. Like that somebody, when asked, the policy that you imposed killed 500,000 Iraqi children. And let's say that it wasn't 500,000. People have debated that. The UNICEF report says a couple 100,000. Clearly, hundreds of thousands of children died, Iraqi children, died from the US sanctions regime during that decade. To just so unflinchingly look and say, yeah, it was absolutely worth it. It's a tough call, but absolutely worth it. That is sociopathic behavior of the worst kind. And that is why I think sanctions deserve so much more attention than they get. Like I said, I think on some level Americans feel like, well, as long as the US isn't going to war, let them do sanctions, because that at least seems like a step before war. But what is the point of it? It never succeeds in weakening the country or removing the leader. It only succeeds in immiserating the population. Here from The Lancet in March of 2020, at the start of the COVID pandemic, you may recall that the COVID pandemic went from China to Iran, and then the two hardest hit countries in Europe early on were Italy and Spain. But Iran was overwhelmed with COVID cases at the very start of the pandemic, before it even got to the United States. And they were under some of the most repressive sanctions possible. And you may look at the Iranian government and hate the Iranian government, but it's not the Iranian government that pays the price for these sanctions. So here from The Lancet, you see the headline, COVID-19 battle during the toughest sanctions against Iran. Quote, the economic loss caused by the spread of COVID-19 in Iran coincides with the ever highest politically induced sanctions against the country. Quote, although various sanctions have been in place for the past 4 decades, since May 2018, the unilateral sanctions imposed by the USA against Iran have increased dramatically to an almost total economic lockdown, which includes severe penalties for non-US companies conducting business with Iran. The Iranian health sector, although among the most resilient in the region, has been affected as a consequence. All aspects of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment are directly and indirectly hampered, and the country is falling short in combating the crisis. Lack of medical, pharmaceutical, and laboratory equipment, such as protective gowns and necessary medication, has been scaling up the burden of the epidemic and the number of casualties. We should not let history repeat itself. More than 500,000 Iraqi children and nearly 40,000 Venezuelans were killed as a result of UN Security Council and US sanctions in 1994 and 2017 to 2018, respectively. Venezuela is another case where people decided that they hated Hugo Chavez, even though he never attacked any other country, and therefore imposed enormous amounts of suffocating sanctions on Venezuela, both under Hugo Chavez and then again under Nicolas Maduro. And then we point to the fact that there's starvation in Venezuela and disease in Venezuela, which there is, at least in part because of this suffocating sanctions regime that did not weaken Hugo Chavez nor Nicolas Maduro. All it did was immiserate the population. So for what? Here from NPR in April of 2021, quote, the beautiful dreams that are burnt, portraits from Iran under sanctions. Kazem Mojaban, a manager in a private hospital in Yazd, said he is dealing with challenges that didn't exist before the sanctions. Even though the U.S. says its restrictions do not target the health center, according to Mojaban, shortages in medicines and surgical equipment are just some examples of how the sanctions end up affecting Iran's medical centers. Naima Mousavi from the capital of Tehran has been under treatment for 2 years and is receiving a kidney transplant. She has confronted new challenges and struggles regarding her treatment, which she says started when the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran. Transplant medications are vital and rare. Because of Iran's shortage of drugs, government-funded hospitals and clinics distribute medicines at the start of each month that cover 4 weeks of treatment. She doesn't know whether she will still have next month's medication. Now, why is that justified? It doesn't prevent Iran from doing much of anything that we say we want to prevent them from doing. And if anything, it's the reason why there's so much hatred and hostility towards the United States in that region. Ron Paul, who I think most people know or was a principled non-interventionist, still is a principled opponent of war, also was a person who believes in economic liberty. He's a libertarian. He's the anti-communist. Nobody can suggest that Ron Paul is sympathetic to communism as an ideology, to put that mildly. And yet he was often horrified by the savage and barbaric regime of sanctions that we imposed on Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and Russia and North Korea for reasons that he has explained many times, including in this August 1st, 2012 speech that he gave on the House floor about the evils of sanctions.
When you put on sanctions on a country, it's an act of war, and that's what this is all about. The first thing you do when war breaks out between two countries is you put sanctions on them. You blockade the country. So this is an act of war. What would we do if somebody blockaded and put sanctions on us and prevented the importation of any product in this country? We'd be furious, we'd declare war, we'd go to war. So we are the antagonists. We're over there poking our nose in other people's affair, just looking for the chance to start another war. First it's Syria, then Iran. We have too many wars. We need to stop the wars. We don't have the money to fight these wars any longer.
And as he noted, sanctions is an act of war. It's a way of attacking other countries. We constantly say here in the United States, it's time to stop trying to fix other countries, interfere in their countries, dictate who their leaders are. That's what sanctions are designed to do. And yet we almost never hear opposition to these sanctions, even though they are costly for Americans in so many ways. Donald Trump, as happens so often, had a kind of instinctive opposition to a lot of policies his administration ended up imposing. One of them was sanctions in Iran. Here from NBC News in September of 2019, reported that Donald Trump and John Bolton sparred over lifting Iran's sanctions. The national security advisor departed abruptly after President Trump suggested he might lift some sanctions as an incentive for Tehran to get to the negotiating table. That was always Trump's instinct, in every case, was to avoid war and negotiate. Quote, as leading national security advisor, John Bolton was a leading advocate of the Trump administration's so-called, quote, maximum pressure campaign designed to squeeze Iran's economy until its leadership was forced to curtail its aggression in the region and concede to U.S. demands to dismantle its nuclear program, none of which has happened. Trump withdrew from the U.S. from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal last year. Iran has since decided not to comply with the agreement. Trump recently has said he would meet with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani perhaps later this month on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session in New York without preconditions. But the person close to Bolton said the president went further during a 2 p.m. meeting on Monday in suggesting he would lift U.S. sanctions. The possibility of Iran's sanctions relief was in part what prompted Bolton to submit a resignation letter to the president the following morning, this person said. Obviously, these leaks are coming from John Bolton to make himself look good. I resigned in protest on principle, in anger that Donald Trump wanted to lift sanctions in Iran, but Trump naturally wants to forge peace deals. And his idea is, we're going to nullify the 2015 deal that Obama negotiated with Iran because it's not tough enough. We want a tougher agreement with Iran. But to get that, we need to negotiate with them and not try and destroy their population. Here from NPR, April of 2023, life in Syria under U.S. sanctions. Earthquakes in Syria expose the devastating needs of people in a war-torn country and raise the questions about the impact of U.S. sanctions. The reason we were told that we had to spend $1 billion a year under President Obama to allow the CIA to try and fight a dirty war alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are our allies in Syria, to remove Bashar al-Assad is because we cared so deeply about the Syrian people. We just want the best for the Syrian people. We want to protect the Syrian people. And yet the sanctions that we ended up imposing that obviously have no effect on removing Bashar al-Assad, did the following, quote, hospitals are lacking MRI machines, CAT scans, heart monitors, and even anesthesia and cancer medications. Oil and banking sanctions were toughened over the past decade to punish President Bashar al-Assad's government as it attacked rebels, bombed civilians, and jailed tens of thousands. The U.S. says its sanctions target Assad's regime and not humanitarian assistance. But doctors in Syria say they have trouble importing basic supplies because foreign banks fear financial penalties. The head of Syria's civil defense said his teams didn't have enough equipment to save lives after the earthquakes. Major General Safwan Baloul said they were in need of basic tools like jackhammers and hydraulic lifts. So it's the same thing repeated over and over. And obviously the same thing has happened in Cuba. The same thing has happened in Venezuela. Here, just to give you a report of the effects of sanctions on Venezuela. Obviously, it has had no effect on weakening that country's government. Here from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, it's written by Mark Weisbrot, who I know and who is an expert in Latin American financial and military policy, as well as Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia professor and economist, who is a regular on our show. And they published this report in April of 2019 entitled Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. And they detailed as well the same kinds of destruction on the healthcare system in Venezuela that make it impossible for ordinary Venezuelans to get access to healthcare. Obviously, when someone like Hugo Chavez has a medical problem, as he did when he had cancer, he was able to travel and get some of the best medical care, including in Cuba. These don't affect the leaders of the country, only the ordinary people. And then beyond all those same harms to medical care and the like in the hospital system that we detailed in Syria and Iran, this also happened as a result of the sanctions on Venezuela. Quote, there was a 31% increase in general mortality from 2017 to 2018. I just want you to think about what that means. There was a 1/3 increase in the number of people who died in Venezuela as a result of sanctions from 2017 to 2018. This would imply an increase of more than 40,000 deaths. More than 300,000 people were estimated to be at risk because of lack of access to medicines or treatments. For what? How do we justify just killing 40,000 Venezuelans in 1 year? What is that accomplishing? Quote, this includes an estimated 80,000 people with HIV who have not had antiretroviral treatment since 2017, 16,000 people with cancer, and 4 million people with diabetes and hypertension, many of whom cannot obtain insulin or cardiovascular medicine. So you have treatable diseases like HIV, and yet people, because of the sanctions in Venezuela, cannot access medications to save their lives. Quote, food imports have dropped sharply along with the overall imports. In 2018, they were estimated at just 2.46 billion as compared with 11.2 billion in 2013. The United Nations finds that the groups most vulnerable to the accelerating crisis includes children and adolescents, including many who can no longer attend school, people who are in poverty or extreme poverty, pregnant and nursing women, older persons, indigenous people, women and adolescent girls at risk, people with disabilities. The sanctions also violate U.S. law. Each executive order since March 2015 declares the United States is suffering from a, quote, national emergency because of the situation in Venezuela. This is required by U.S. law in order to impose such sanctions. The national emergency is invoked under the 1976 National Emergencies Act. Here is Mike Pompeo. He obviously featured a lot in our first segment on Julian Assange, and I regard him as Donald Trump's worst mistake. He put him in charge of the CIA and then also made him Secretary of State, even though Mike Pompeo is a classic neocon. Everything Donald Trump claimed he opposed, that was by far Trump's worst vulnerability, is putting people in power who flattered him, regardless of what their ideology or their politics were, or what they intended to do, or whether they had any interest in aligning with the political platform on which he ran. We'll see whether or not, if he wins again, he makes that same mistake. But Mike Pompeo was Exhibit A in that character flaw of Donald Trump that was one of the worst flaws of the Trump presidency. Here's Mike Pompeo pontificating on the sanctions regime.
Continue to take place. Second question was, what Matt, remind me what the second one was. The first one was about, were we satisfied with oil? We're trying to get the oil for the Venezuelan people.
Not for
the Venezuelan people. We are attempting to restore basic rule of law, transparency, democracy, and the wealth that sits in the property basin of Venezuela is for the Venezuelan people.
And then the pace of
the first question is the pace of change.
We love the Venezuelan people. We love them so much, just like we love the Syrian people, that we impose on them sanctions that completely devastate their lives, kill them in large numbers, prevent them from getting medications, prevent them from getting basic sustenance, including food. That's how much we love the Venezuelan people. That's how much we love the Syrian people. And even if you don't care about the moral or ethical component of sanctions, they have incredible geopolitical blowback, and they just simply don't work, to the point where even this most comprehensive sanctions regime that has been imposed on Russia has coincided with the kind of economic growth that we began the segment by documenting, and the ability of Russians to simply form their own separate economy outside of the United States' control, where their oil revenues are increased, where their economic prosperity is increased, where their military strength is increased as well. That is the reality of the sanctions regime.